Hello everyone and welcome to lecture number 4 for chapter 18. We are finally wrapping up the endocrine system with the fourth and final lecture, and as you can see, as though we've been going through my previous lectures, I broke this up into 2 parts. Most lectures, as you know, get broken up into 2 or 3 parts, and typically a lecture is about an hour to an hour and 10 minutes of material, but I like breaking them up into 20 to 30 minute segments here. So we're going to finish up the 4th unit here. We do have part 1, which I argue is a little bit on the easier side. We're just kind of going through although I tend to try to say we avoid memorization, there's just pretty much memorization on this final part. We do have one stepwise thing that you're going to really need to get good at. We'll talk about that once we get there, and then we finish up with basically your stress response, and hopefully you never reach this exhaustion phase, and hopefully resistance phase is short-lived. So let's get into this. We'll talk about these things as we finish up here, and then finally we save our final part of this lecture and the final part of the chapter 18 here for what I consider the hardest part, to compare and contrast how lipid-soluble hormones work with water-soluble. We'll see that at the end there. So we still have quite a bit to wrap up here, and then we move on for my class. We move on to chapter 22, which is immunity, and that's where we're going to spend a good portion of our time to finish up this unit. So this unit consists of endocrine system and the immune system and lymphatics. So keep in mind that's what we're covering. If you're taking another course, there's a good chance you are moving on to chapter 19, which is blood. That would be following kind of the order of the book, but I like to keep cardiovascular system as one unit, which is why I move on to chapter 22, and then we'll end up covering the cardiovascular system as a whole there. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to hop around a little bit here. As always, you got my objectives. You know I don't review these. If you want to pause this to read over them so you kind of have a general understanding of what's being covered in this lecture, you can see that here. And if that's not what you're looking for, well, this is what I'm covering in the second lecture. As usual with my first parts of each lecture, I do like including the citations. If you've been following my lecture series, you know I've been following along with Pearson's Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology, written by Martini, Nath, and Bartholomew here. And we're just following right along with chapter 18, and I make use of most of the images found within that book there. All right, so we're going to start off with what I consider some of the sort of easier concepts, kind of like how muscles you had the agonist muscle and the protagonist, and we're going to talk about those, the synergist and those sort of things. So hormones cause obviously different responses on tissues, and they can have unique effects when other hormones are present. So keep this in mind. This is basically saying when we have 2 hormones targeting the same tissue, those hormones might function completely different in comparison to a different organ that has those same receptors, because of course we haven't gotten to this yet, but the second messengers and kind of how the responses are carried out, that might be different from one tissue to the other. So not really a huge point to get carried on about and get caught up with, but the main point we're going to talk about is how 2 hormones that have 2 differing hormones can have different effects and what we call those effects that they have. So there's really 3 distinct sort of hormone combinations. There's the antagonistic hormones, there's the synergistic hormones, and there's the permissive. So again, this is when 2 hormones target the same tissue, the sort of effects that 2 hormones can have on a tissue. That's all we're talking about. Don't overthink this. These are pretty much definitions, and then being able to identify a combination of hormones and identify, is that an antagonistic effect or would it be synergistic? All right, so when we talk antagonistic, of course, we're talking about opposite or opposing effects. And you should be able to name a couple hormone combinations like this. There's 2 that I can think of really, really fast off the top of my head, and hopefully you were able to come up with them. If you want to pause it and think about it, I would encourage you to do so, but I'm going to give up the answer right here. And of course, we're talking hormones secreted by the thyroid gland. So we have calcitonin, right? That was the C cell secreting it, and PTH. Those were completely opposing effects. This stimulated the osteoblast, right, to uptake calcium. This stimulated the osteoclast to break down bone and release calcium. So completely opposing effects. Insulin and glucagon. Insulin, we know, is secreted pretty much kind of when blood glucose levels really shoot up. So insulin is not really going to be a maintaining of blood glucose. It's going to be secreted when blood glucose rise because we just consumed a meal. And then, of course, we secrete that to get the cells to start building those energy reserves. And of course, glucagon is what gets secreted during fasting phases, and that's being secreted to maintain blood glucose, right? So this maintains blood glucose when things get really extreme after a meal, and this maintains it during fasting. So again, opposing or antagonistic hormones. Can you define antagonistic hormones? And then do you kind of know these combinations here? All right. And then we have synergistic, and that would have been having additive effects. And so you can think PTH, so parathyroid hormone, and calcitriol. Those had similar effects as both of those stimulated the osteoclast. Now remember, PTH targets the kidneys to cause reabsorption at the kidneys, where calcitriol targeted the intestines. That's the main difference. This does not target the intestines. This does not target the kidneys. So make sure you know the difference. But overall, they have additive effects because they're going to target those osteoclasts and stimulate them. ADH and aldosterone, you can think of those as blood pressure blood pressure related signals that are going to increase the blood pressure. All right, and even renin, we're going to see a hormone called renin coming up. Renin ultimately is what leads to help stimulate aldosterone release. So we'll see all these things coming up, but know the similar effects. If I ask it on the exam, hands down, you need to be able to identify, oh, those are synergistic pairs, or oh, those are antagonistic. Now for permissive is when a hormone of interest only works in the presence of another hormone being available. The only example I know is epinephrine, norepinephrine, only work at normal levels when thyroid hormone is present. So understand these effects, epinephrine, norepinephrine, require thyroid hormone. It's the only example I know of. So really know these definitions. Definitely don't get too caught up here and spend too much time on this. This should not take too long to really get these hormones down. All right, so the next major part that we have to get to is the secondary endocrine functions. So there's many organs that do have secondary endocrine functions, meaning their primary function, we wouldn't call them an endocrine organ. Like the thyroid gland is strictly an endocrine organ. It's really not doing anything else except producing thyroid hormone, which is extremely important. Don't make it seem like I'm saying it's not important, but that is strictly an endocrine organ. Most of the organs we just talked about were primarily endocrine. All right. But when we come to something like the kidney, this one prime means primary. Its primary function is hands down waste removal and urine formation. And yes, I would expect you to know that on an exam. If I ask you anything about the kidney, I definitely expect you to note that. But its secondary function is the main point for, of course, this unit in this lecture here. But its secondary function is to produce calcitriol, which you should know is a steroid derivative. I've stressed that. You need to know that. The rest of them are peptide derivatives. So erythropoietin and renin, those are considered peptide derivatives. When it comes down to these, you need to know their functions. We've already talked about calcitriol, so I hope you know the functions. You should think it in your head before I click the button. What are the functions of calcitriol? Well, the functions, of course, of calcitriol were very similar to PTH. So it stimulates the effects of PTH, because remember, PTH stimulation is what really causes calcitriol release. But remember, that means it stimulates the osteoclasts, and it causes an increase in calcium absorption at the intestines. So all that's saying is calcitriol increases the level of calcium in our bloodstream. That's what you need to know. It increases blood calcium levels. All right, but erythropoietin, this is something that you're definitely going to talk about in Chapter 19 because it's related to red blood cells. Red blood cells are known as erythrocytes. So erythropoietin, it literally stimulates the production of red blood cells, which means it targets the red bone marrow. So if you don't know what it targets red bone marrow. And you should know what's going to stimulate the release of EPO. Well, we need red blood cells to carry oxygen, so it's stimulated when our oxygen levels are low, and this is why, where blood doping comes in. If people go to higher altitudes, basically your body is kind of tricked into thinking there's less oxygen because of the partial pressure, so you don't have this great exchange of oxygen like you normally do at normal sea level, and therefore your body will literally start producing more red blood cells, and then of course, what athletes do is they remove their blood, so now their blood cell production goes up even more, and then when they get back to normal levels, they basically inject themselves with those red blood cells, which is really, really terrible. You're basically increasing blood pressure and can actually cause stroke and those sort of things. So it can be really, really dangerous to do something like that. All right, but know what EPO is. I'm just kind of giving you an example of EPO and why it's stimulated in low oxygen levels. All right, renin is probably one of the most important ones. This is the one that you're going to need to spend some time on and really get the details down. Okay, but what renin is, it's an enzyme that's going to end up stimulating, ending up converting angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, and then there's another enzyme that converts it to angiotensin 2, and ultimately it stimulates it to angiotensin 2, which leads to the release of ADH and aldosterone, which ultimately increases blood pressure. Now, I know this is confusing. All you need to understand is renin is the starting point that eventually leads to the release of angiotensin 2. Okay, so to be clear, renin eventually leads to the production of angiotensin 2. What's angiotensin 2 do? It stimulates the release of ADH and aldosterone, which ultimately increase blood pressure, right? Because that's what we're talking about there. So the major point is you associate renin with an increase in blood pressure. That's the big picture. How does it increase blood pressure? It ultimately leads to the release of angiotensin 2. Like I said, we're going to see the details in just a second. But before we do, I want to cover at least one more other organ. So the final organ to note, again, this is primary function, is going to be the intestines. And so when we think the primary function of the intestines, we know it is to digest and absorb nutrients. Again, I expect you to know that. Its hormones that it secretes should be obvious. The secondary function is to secrete hormones that regulate the digestive process. So that's all you need to know about the intestines. A question on the exam, something like, which of the following organs secretes hormones that regulate digestion? I hands down expect you to see the intestines. And it's really the only digestive organ that we really talk about besides the pancreas. Obviously, the pancreas is another one. So I got to be a little bit careful how I word it. But regulating hormone or regulating digestion is definitely the intestines. Okay. Obviously, pancreas sort of does, but pancreas is really blood glucose. So I guess I can just stick with the intestines. All right. But very basic there. So to be crystal clear, kidney, you need to know a lot about. I test heavily on it. I often label up on the lab exam the kidney and say, name a hormone. Sometimes I say name 2 hormones. Sometimes I say name all 3 hormones secreted by this organ. So know the kidney secretes these 3. It's one of my organs that I like testing on heavily that isn't a primary endocrine organ. It's a secondary endocrine organ, but it is important nonetheless. You need to know the kidney, and you really need to know renin, which brings us to this point. All right, so this figure right here, this is just showing you calcitriol being released by the kidney, and then showing you it stimulates the absorption of calcium at the intestines. And that's what I focus on. All right, so that's all it's showing you. There's vitamin D, cholecalciferol is vitamin D. It gets converted at the liver, and then finally produced as calcitriol at the kidney through some chemical changes, and we're not getting into all those different changes. But ultimately, you should know calcitriol stimulates the absorption of calcium at the intestines and stimulates osteoclast. So we're clear on that one. Now, as far as this goes, this is what renin does. Now, I do expect you to know these specifics. So notice, I said ultimately renin leads to the release of angiotensin 2, which leads to aldosterone, ADH, and stimulation of thirst, which ultimately increases fluid intake and retention. So notice it increases blood pressure. That's the ultimate goal. Here you can see erythropoietin increasing red blood cells. Notice rising blood volume and pressure. So notice more cells in the blood means more pressure as well. But renin's direct effect. So renin's, again, to be clear, this is perspective. Renin's ultimate big picture effect is to increase blood pressure by causing a release of aldosterone and ADH. Now, if I ask what is renin's direct effect, renin directly converts something called angiotensinogen. Now, notice we have an inogen ending. If you remembered early in lecture 1, I mentioned hormones are secreted often as prohormones, and if you see the word like proinsulin, you know it's the inactive form. Same with inogen ending. So angiotensinogen is an inactive form of angiotensin. So renin takes this inactive angiotensinogen and converts it to angiotensin 1. That's what you need to know. That's the direct route. The other thing you need to know is angiotensin 1 gets converted to angiotensin 2 by the ACE enzyme, and ACE literally stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Once angiotensin 2 is present, that's what leads to the release of this. So renin's big picture effect is to increase blood pressure by leading to aldosterone and ADH secretion. Okay, that's the big picture. But on the exam, I sometimes ask, what is renin directly responsible? It's directly responsible for this. In fact, if you're confused how I would word this on the exam, if I'm looking for the big picture effect, nothing about these conversions is going to be on there. Like, I'm not going to say, what's the big picture effect, and expect you to know this, and then have an answer choice that says converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. That's not going to happen. If I ask big picture, it's going to be like, regulates blood glucose levels, increases pH, increases blood pressure. Those would be the answer choices. When I expect you to know the specific, all the answer choices would be converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, which is the ACE enzyme, so that's an incorrect answer. So main point is study this, review this, understand this figure here. This is the most important figure you should note. I will test on this multiple times with renin. Renin is another enzyme that you need to recognize, or another hormone that you need to recognize that increases blood pressure. All right, so notice the release of renin and erythropoietin, an overview of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, beginning with the activation of angiotensin by renin. So that's just showing you renin's role is begins a chemical cascade, essentially. But main point is, make sure you spend some time there and get that down. Now, we move on to, of course, the heart and the thymus, as you can see by the title of this slide, and hopefully you know what the heart does. What does the heart do? It monitors and generates what? Well, hopefully you got it down that it monitors and generates, of course, blood pressure. All right, but the hormone that the heart produces is natriuretic peptides, AMP and BMP, technically AMP, but we're not going to be that specific on in this class. I always list things as natriuretic peptides, and then I also put them in parentheses just like this here, and you should know that's how it's going to be listed. What it does is it opposes angiotensin 2, meaning it's another antagonistic hormone. So it's antagonistic to angiotensin 2, which means you should be able to come up with this answer. Pause it if you want to think about it. But it ultimately decreases blood pressure. All right, so when is it secreted? It's secreted when blood volume and or blood pressure are high. Natriuretic peptides' goal are to decrease blood pressure. Okay, that's its ultimate goal. How does it do it? Well, it increases the output or stimulates or increases urination. So that's what this is saying. It stimulates the output, i.e. how much fluids we lose, or stimulate/increases urination, i.e. by causing more, by preventing something called aquaporins being produced. That's what ADH causes, and you don't need to know this for now. We're going to save this aquaporin thing for Unit 4 when we talk about the kidneys. But essentially, aquaporins are what allow for the reabsorption of water in our kidney tubes. Basically, think of tubes having holes in them. That's what ADH does. ADH puts holes in our urine tubes, and that allows water to come back in. Well, natriuretic peptides blocks that, and so now you have tubes that have no holes or no pores in them, and so the water just flows right to our kidney. That's the detailed side. You don't need to get caught up on this. All you need to know about natriuretic peptides, and this is the main point that you need to know, is it decreases blood pressure and is secreted when blood pressure is high. If you got that down, you have the main points for now. We will be stressing natriuretic peptide because it is a blood pressure related hormone, and blood pressure hormones are going to follow us throughout the entire semester. All right, as far as the thymus goes, we're going to be talking a lot about the thymus later, really when we get to chapter 22. So our next chapter after this lecture, we're going to be getting into this. So you definitely need to know this because obviously it's 2 chapters worth of material. Well, the thymus is the site where T cells mature. What are T cells? Again, you're going to know this by the end of the unit. You're definitely going to know this. T cells are a type of lymphocyte of the adaptive immune system or adaptive immunity, i.e. these are the cells that we develop by getting like vaccinations and those sort of things, and then when we're exposed to another pathogen that's the same, our T cells that are memory T cells will destroy them. But the main point about the thymus is it produces and secretes a hormone called thymosins, and these are thymic hormones that really stimulate T cell maturation. So know the function of the thymus, which you'll learn, and then know thymosins are what are going to stimulate the T cell maturation and production process. That's it. That's all you really need to get down. All right, so again, heart is the main one, natriuretic peptides. This is just straight recognition. You don't need to spend too much time studying this, but natriuretic peptide, big one to note. All right, and then finally we finish up our hormone lecture. So this is it. These are the final hormones to note. We finish it up with the gonads, and if you don't know what the gonads are, that's just the catch-all term for them for reproductive organs. It's a catch-all because obviously the male and female reproductive systems differ, and therefore the gonads is just a catch-all term. And so you should note that the testes mainly produce testosterone. You should know it's a steroid hormone. And the main point is it helps develop the sex characteristics, especially the secondary sex characteristics, so like muscle growth, a deeper voice, those sort of things. Also important for sex drive and bone and muscle growth, but most importantly, the thing that I often test on is spermatogenesis, which literally is the production of sperm. So note, testes produce testosterone. Testosterone's main point is to stimulate spermatogenesis or sperm production and is important for the secondary sex characteristics. That's it. That's what you need to know. Spermatogenesis and testosterone, steroid hormone. Those are the major points you need to get down. Now, the ovaries secrete two. The ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone, which are still steroid-based hormones. Estrogen is important for the development of the uterus and vagina and the fetal development stage, but later in life, it's important for follicle and egg development at puberty. So estrogen, usually I'm stressing follicle and egg development. And then as far as progesterone goes, this is produced by something called the corpus luteum. We're going to get to that later. That's once the egg is released and the follicle develops, it ends up forming something called the corpus luteum. And the point of progesterone that I really stress for students is maintenance of the uterus for now. Okay, lack of progesterone leads to menstruation. It's certainly important for mammary gland development, but the main focus, just so we're all clear on this slide, testosterone is secreted by the testes for sperm growth and male development, the male sex characteristics. Estrogen and progesterone are important for development in general, but estrogen is for egg and follicle development, and progesterone is the maintenance of the uterus. Okay, so those are the things I would focus on. All right, so that wraps up every single hormone that we're going to talk about. I highly recommend you review these figures and these tables. So notice table 18.5 through 18.7. I have 18.7 and 18.6 on there. And you can see it's going through telling you, this. In this case, 18.7 was the reproductive system. It's going through and telling you where these hormones are coming from. They're getting into a lot more details. Stick to the basics. I don't test heavily on these yet. I save that for Unit 4, but the basics are certainly fair game. Estrogen and follicle and egg development. Progesterone, maintaining uterus. Those are the major points. And you can just see they're literally listing the hormones and all their major functions. In this case, this is the secondary. This is organs that have endocrine as secondary functions. Okay. The final concept for this lecture, so the last, so lecture 4 here, part 1, to conclude this, I want to talk about our what's called general adaptive syndrome. This is basically our stress response, and it's a pattern of our hormonal and physiological adjustments that occur due to stress, and you can see that in figure 18.20 there. But there's ultimately 3 phases, and that's what I would study, is the 3 phases and the main points of these 3 phases. Now, your first phase is the alarm phase. This is our everyday stress. It basically leads to sympathetic stimulation that ultimately mobilizes our energy reserves, which means we release epinephrine, norepinephrine, and that's kind of it, i.e. catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, they're water-soluble, super short-lived response. And that's the alarm phase, and that's how most of our day, how we deal with most of that stress. Like, oh no, I realize the test is coming up, I'm a little anxious about that, but I got to focus on something else. That kind of quick jolts. You know, you get a phone call and you're maybe waiting for the doctor and it's the doctor calling, all of a sudden your heart starts racing. That's really what we're talking about with this alarm phase. Just notice it's a short-lived response. It's how we deal and cope with everyday stress. It gives us that energy boost to kind of get through the thing as fast as possible. All right, so here's your alarm phase. You can see the figure. Notice general sympathetic activation. That's really what the alarm phase is, immediate response to stress. All right, quick energy reserves. Notice, deal with the stress-causing factor in the fight or flight response. Basically, deal with it, get through the stressor, and then you move on. All right, but we often know that sometimes stress isn't that simple, right? We certainly have situations where stress lasts for multiple days. You know, think about finals week. So finals week is coming up. It's the last 2, maybe 3 weeks of class. You know, all these exams and all these things are coming down to finish and complete. Well, that's what we're talking about on the next. And so the next phase is the resistance phase. And resistance phase is stress that lasts longer than a few hours. So this is things that you know you have to take care of. Like I said, final exams a really good one. You know, we all have to deal with things like death, right? And so any of those circumstances leading up to, you know, that's why funerals and things are important. It helps you get over and move on. And that's the resistance phase, being able to deal with these longer term stresses. But I'm going to stick with, of course, finals because that's the easiest thing to relate to. But what happens is, this is where you need to note that steroid hormones start to get involved, and this is where we have longer lasting effects. So notice the glucocorticoids. So notice, I always list cortisol and cortisone. So cortisol and cortisone secretion. Notice mineralocorticoids. Notice the angiotensin system. That is our stress response there. Okay. And basically what you need to know in the resistance phase is this is going to last days to weeks, potentially months. But basically you're relying on your cortisol. And as you saw when we were talking about those those secretions. I mentioned that cortisol is a stress hormone. I stress that it's the stress metabolic response, and if you remember, it causes it causes an increase in glucose by breaking down things like amino acids off of muscle, which is not good. So think about that. If we're literally breaking down, notice lipids are released by adipose tissue, amino acids are released by skeletal muscle. We're trying to build up glucose. Notice elevation of blood glucose levels. So if you look at all of this, this is the long-term adjustments that are going to be sustained. So higher blood pressure, because we of course have aldosterone. So these are long-term phases. The major point you need to know is it's when stress lasts long and we start secreting cortisol and cortisone. That's the thing that I'm going to stress. But no, it's also it does include aldosterone as well. All right, exhaustion phase should be the obvious one. This is when you have been at this for weeks to months, and basically your muscle tissue is now and organs are starting to be damaged. And that's really the only way to describe that stress response is stress that has been up for so long that your organs are now damaged and have lost and are being depleted and basically just taking on damage. And that's really what I would talk about. So at this point, I would say all energy reserves have been depleted and your organ systems are now taking damage. Where here, you're starting to deplete your energy reserves through the use of like cortisol. All right, so just make sure you know these. These are really straightforward. They're very different phases, right? The alarm phase talks about epinephrine, norepinephrine. The resistance phase is all about cortisol and cortisone. And then the exhaustion phase is all about damage to tissues. All right, so this lecture went a little bit longer. I always try to stay within 20 to 30 minutes, preferably on the lower end of 20 minutes. We're at the higher end, moving on currently about 27 minutes here. So hopefully these first 4 objectives are pretty clear, and hopefully you feel like you can address those after listening to this lecture. If not, figure out which areas you're missing in. But this, like I've been saying, these group note reviews are a guide to say, hey, do you know the content? And if you're able to answer seriously, if you can go through all my group note reviews, especially the ones that I post on discussion boards, if you can answer those without notes, you pretty much can tell yourself, hey, you're about 80 to 90% prepared, which is really, really in good shape. All right, look out for our final part to this lecture, and the final part, which is really the final episode, essentially ending chapter 18 here. So this is what we're down to get through these. It's quite challenging. It's kind of more on the specific spot, but now that we have a good understanding of hormones, I feel like talking about this, which was mentioned early in the chapter. So if you were reading the book, I skipped over this. I feel like now that you understand hormones and hopefully how to sort of categorize them, that this final objective in this final lecture here that's coming up, the final part to lecture number 4 here, I hope is going to make a lot more sense. So that's what I've re-recorded this. I'm thinking it's going to hopefully flows a lot better for students. All right, everyone, take care. Look out for the last and final part to wrap up lecture number 4 and to wrap up chapter 18. Thanks for listening. I'll see you at part 2 of lecture 4.